Hi guys, how's it going? Ivano here, and not sure if you've seen it already, but BioWare dropped some surprising balance changes yesterday. Of course, today the patch is already live, so I had a first chance to test it. So I wanted to go over all of the balance changes from a PvPer's perspective and just try to analyze what they mean for the game and the meta. So without further ado, let's take it from the top. First of all, PvP, all group members can now see that they are queued. And the queue icon now only glows when the group is queued for Warzone and PvP arena matches. This is basically a bug fix. They broke that in one of the earlier patches. In the past, it was only the group leader that could see when you are queued. And then at some point they tried to fix it and they broke it even more. So the icon was always glowing. Gonna need to test it in a group, but hopefully this is fixed and actually works now. Nice. Next up, there are some class balance changes. These came up as a bit of a surprise. But let's go through them. So first of all, Assassin Shadow, there's just a bug fix to some lightsaber that doesn't really change anything. And then Darkness Combat, that's the first actual change. So they redesigned the Ancient Tome of Wrath, so that's a tactical that no one was really using, at least for PvP. They renamed it to the Tome of Exarchun, and that now grants you damage reduction as well as shield whenever you gain a stack of Redirected Wrath. Now what is Redirected Wrath? That is passive you get when you use Wither, and if you use a tactical, then you will gain some extra damage reduction in AoE situations and shield chance, I guess. So what does it mean for assassin tanks? Well, it means they become a bit better in AoE Zerg situations. I think it's a good buff. They're clearly the worst tank at the moment, especially when running a skank tank setup. They can be a bit squishy, but their damage is actually quite good. So I can see some situations where you want to run that if you want to focus on team fighting. It can be situationally better than 2 cloaks. Depends a little bit on the war zone and what you want to do. But if you're playing Shadow Tank or Assassin, then definitely try out this tactical. Next up, and these are the big changes. Of course, it wouldn't be a patch without a buff to Sorcerer and Sage. So let's take it from the top. Teachings of Rajivari mod and Plague Master now deals the correct type of damage. Not sure why this is under Sorcerer Sage. This is actually a madness only change. Anyway, let's get back to that later. We start with Lightning. And on Lightning, the first big change, which by the way also affects madness, is that Force Mobility is now baseline. So what does that mean? Force Mobility, of course, is the level 51 utility that lets you cast while moving. For the Sorcerer heal, it used to be Innervate, right? So you pick that utility, you can cast Innervate while you're moving. For Lightning, it makes Thundering Blast castable while moving, and for Madness, it was Force Leech. Now, Lightning will always have that baseline. So let's quickly look at the Lightning tree. So this is how it looks for Lightning, and in level 51, you now have a new utility, because now you can always cast while moving. So, long story short, the DPS Sorcerer specs can now always cast their big ability while moving. The Sorcerer heal still needs to spec into it. Why they changed that when Sorcerer is already the most mobile range spec in the game, I am not sure, but nevertheless they changed it, so it's now in the game. In place of that utility at level 51, Lightning and Madness are now both getting Torturous Tactics. Now, Torturous Tactics is an old utility that I think was already in the game in past expansions, but got removed with 7.0. Does the following: it lowers the cooldown of Electrocute, which is your hard stun, by 10 seconds. And then in addition, whatever target you stun will deal 25% less damage for 10 seconds after the stun wears off. I did not know that, but Cease pointed out in a forum post, and by the way, if you don't already follow Cease Faith on YouTube, you should definitely do so now. I will also link to his channel in the description below. But he pointed out that this utility is actually even stronger than it sounds on paper, because if you didn't know, Alacrity reduces the cooldown of offensive abilities, like for example Electrocute, your hard stun on Sorcerer. So if you're playing Sorcerer with like a high Alacrity build, which you should, especially on Lightning, and then you pop Polarity Shift and you cast a little bit, stack your Alacrity on Lightning Sorc, then you can have something like a 30-35 seconds cooldown on your hard stun now. So the cooldown reduction of this talent works out to actually more than 10 seconds. So by default, I have a 54-second cooldown. Now if I pick Torturous Tactics, that will go down to 45 seconds. But now watch what happens if I start casting. So I'm just doing my normal rotation. And as you know, lightning gets these stacks. Here, they're called Focal Lightning, and they give you free alacrity. Now my cooldown is already 43 seconds, but watch what happens if I pop Polarity Shift. Now my cooldown is 36 seconds. If I use it now on a Polarity Shift, I have a hard stun with a 36-second cooldown. So, since Sorcerers now have their Force Mobility baseline, they can afford to pick this new or old talent. And it's very strong offensively, of course, because of the shorter cooldown on your hard stun. But then also the 25% less damage dealt debuff is even stronger than it sounds because it is additive, meaning that it is a separate category from damage reduction. So it is even more impactful than, for example, Cloud Mind, which is a 25% damage reduction. Of course, the 25% less damage dealt debuff only applies to one player, the player that you stun. But in an arena, if you can, for example, debuff the enemy PowerTech that's about to pop fuel on you, that is, of course, a huge buff. It is also huge for 1v1 situations in war zones, and overall just a great buff to Sorcerers, especially for Lightning. The Elemental Convection build could be a little weak to being bursted in a 1v1, because typically in that build you're not running Phase Walk. Now, of course, with this change, it is way better and a buff to Lightning, which was already one of the best specs in the game. Moving on to Madness. And here is where I'm really wondering what the guys at BioWare, Broadsword, were thinking. Plague Master mod now deals the correct type of damage. What does it mean? Plague Master, of course, is the level 27 utility that finishes your dots off with shock. Now, there was a bug in the past that Demolish was doing internal damage when you use it with Plague Master instead of kinetic damage, which is actually supposed to do. And as we know, internal damage is better because it is not affected or mitigated by armor. So I tested this, and on 7.3.1 it looks like Demolish is now properly doing kinetic damage when finished with Plague Master. Demolish now doing kinetic damage is a nerf because, previously internal damage means not mitigated by armor and it was stronger. This is a nerf mostly for PvE. In PvP, previously you could not really afford to take Plague Master because at level 27, particularly for arenas or against really strong burst, you needed to pick Cloud Mind to have a defensive cooldown. But wait for it. Second change, we already talked about this with the lightning changes. Force mobility is now baseline for Madness, meaning you'll be able to cast your Force Leech on the move without needing to spec into it. And that's great because, of course, that means at level 51, you also now have access to Torturous Tactics. And we already talked about this, why this is insane with the lightning changes. But for Madness, it is also huge for a 1v1. It is another buff to Madness Sorcerer. Of course, Madness usually already runs Phase Walk in PvP. They have their barrier, they have lots of heal. So with this change, forget about ever killing them 1v1. Next, Madness changes. Shifted critical movement or enhanced force speed if you're playing Rap to the level 27 row. Level 27, wait for it, this is where Cloud Mind used to be, which you would previously always take in PvP. So they moved Cloud Mind from level 27 to level 43. And that means on level 27 you can now take critical movement, which essentially makes it so the cooldown of your force speed will be only 8 or 9 seconds as long as you do damage with your dots. Or, of course, you can now take Plague Master, which gives you access to one of the best bursts in the game as Madness. And I tested Plague Master, and even after the nerfs that we just discussed, or let's say the bug fix to Demolish, it can still crit for up to 170k in one hit. So as Madness, you can now choose between having insane mobility with critical movement or insane burst with Plague Master. So finally, shifted Cloud Mind to the level 43 row. Now this one is actually a significant nerf to Madness. Why? Because at level 43, you already have probably the strongest defensive utility in the game, which is Corrupted Defense. So now Madness Sorcerers have to choose between 25% damage reduction for 6 seconds with a 45-second cooldown in Cloud Mind, which is of course better against being bursted, especially by multiple enemies. Or you can pick Corrupted Defense, which gives you stacking damage reduction as long as you crit with your dots. So this one is basically 15% damage reduction that you will always have up. And of course, in a longer drawn out fight, this one is way better, but you can also pick Cloud Mind against Burst. Previously, you could pick both, which was one of the reasons why Madness, on top of having great mobility, damage, insane control, and overpowered self-heal, was the absolute best spec in the game. Now you have to choose between one of these two forms of damage reduction, but Madness is still fine, especially if we're looking at Torturous Tactics, which allows you to debuff one enemy 25% for 10 seconds. The only place where Madness really loses is if you get bursted by multiple enemies, because then you have to choose between Cloud Mind and you can only stun one of them. So all in all, what does it mean for Madness? Madness has a way lower cooldown on their hard stun, and you can choose between either having insane mobility or insane burst, neither of which you could really afford to take before. Then you get better mitigation against burst in a 1v1, and the only thing that is actually nerfed is if you get bursted by multiple targets and you're not running Cloud Mind. So overall a buff to the strongest DPS specs in the game. Not really sure why this was necessary. I guess whoever was responsible for these changes is clearly a Sorcerer main. Okay, looking at the Mercenary changes. First of all, Signature Shot has been redesigned and I'll spare you the reading. Basically, it now buffs your rail shot damage by 10%. Before, it was already buffing priming shot. So the rail shot part is new. And rail shot, of course, is your auto crit on Merc. Now it will hit 10% harder. Nothing too crazy, but a nice little damage buff. Let's just quickly test how hard rail shot hits now exactly. So if everything crits, it can burst quite hard, but it is nothing compared, for example, to an advanced prototype or an engineering sniper. Nevertheless, nice little buff for arsenal damage. Next one, Thrill of the Hunt, is now baseline, so this is the same change we already saw for Sorcerer DPS. You can now cast your Blazing Bolts while moving, and that is nice, but for Mercenaries, it is actually more impactful than it is for Sorcerers. Because if we look at the combat style tree, previously you had to pick between Call to Search, Power Shield, and Thrill of the Hunt, which lets you cast Blazing Bolt while moving. Now you have, first of all, this new utility, Tag and Bag, gives you 15% Electricity when you pop net. That is nice, but I think in PvP, what is actually more impactful is the possibility to pick Super Kolto. So this one, in case you didn't know, makes your Kolto really powerful, heal you up to 60%, and makes Kolto, most importantly, last longer and heal you for twice as much. Meaning, if you pop it, you can't really be bursted through it. So this one gives you another hard defensive cooldown. It might even make it so that you can drop Reflect and pick Rocket out, which on top with your better baseline mobility, that you now always have hydraulics, you can always cast while moving, makes Mercenary actually less of a punching bag and way more mobile in a war zone. So making casting while moving baseline is a great change for Mercenary. Another very nice buff on top of the 10% rail shot damage. The Tag and Back utility, I mean, you're probably not going to use this unless maybe you play Arena and you need a really fast kill. But then again, I think Super Kolto at this level is just the better option. And this is going to be a nice buff for Arsenal. Okay, the IO Merc is getting the same change. They are also getting Thrill of the Hunt baseline, meaning they can now also pick Super Kolto, which should make them way harder to kill in PvP. Mercenary Healer, however, similar to the Sorc heal, still needs to pick the Thrill of the Hunt, so casting while moving. That is fair. I think Mercenary Healer is already tanky enough. So they still need to choose between being more mobile and being really tanky with Super Kolto. So overall, Mercenary, particularly Arsenal, gets a little bit more damage, better mobility, and will be way tankier. So I think that's a well-deserved buff for a spec that was underperforming in PvP at least. Next, we're moving on to PowerTech and Vanguard. Boiling Point change. I think that one mostly affects PvE. No one is really picking this one in PvP anyway. For Shield Tech and Shield Specialist, so the tank, a slight buff to the Oil Fire Tactical, but you're not really picking that. Most of the tanks in PvP right now are using a Skank tank setup, so you're going to be running a Damage Tactical, and you're not going to be using this Tactical. but even though the change from 2 to 3% damage reduction is not that impactful. The counter-attack mod has been slightly changed. I think they added Firestorm to the ability. Previously, it only used to buff the damage of your rail shot when you shielded an attack. Now, when you shield an attack, you're also going to have 10% more damage on Firestorm. This is nice, but it's at the same level as picking the big flamethrower, which does more damage. But I guess sometimes if it's a very mobile fight, you can pick this. And then 10% more damage when you shield is nice. But overall, not a big difference. Finally, Juggernaut Guardian. This is for the tank discipline. Reduce the damage bonus given to Crushing Blow by crushing Mark from 50% to 40%. This is of course the tactical that buffs your Crushing Blow damage to taunted targets by 50%, now it's 40%. I think that's a fair nerf. The ability is still too strong, can crit for 100k and is actually an AoE. Way too strong for a tank in my opinion at least. In the previous patch they buffed the base damage by 10%. Now they're nerfing this talent by 10%, but I think overall the ability is still very strong in Juggernaut tank. At least from a damage perspective, is still more than good. And then finally, the Horde's Makashi Strike tactical now increases your damage reduction by 7% when it triggers. This is up from 5%. And that makes Juggernaut tanks, again, only if you run this tactical, a little bit more resistant to being tank tunneled. 7% DR definitely is not nothing, but then you're not running a damage tactical, so it's a trade-off. I think outside of pre-made games where you're trying to guard people, but then you get tank tunneled by Madness Sorcerers, I don't really see this tactical being too impactful either. So it's a situational change at best. And that's it. Looking at the overall state of the game, I'm not really sure why they're buffing the best class in the game, which is Sorcerers. I mean, maybe not thinking about Sorcerer Heal, they didn't really get changed at all, but Lightning is already very strong. Now they will be even stronger. Madness is arguably the strongest spec in PvP. And now they're getting lower cooldown on their hard stun, they're getting more mobility or better burst, and their survivability is not really bad either. Their heal is not getting touched, which is the really strong thing about the spec, on top of the great control which they have with their knockbacks, their rotational roots and slows, and none of that is getting changed. So arguably this is a buff to the spec that already dominates PvP and doesn't really make any sense. And then secondly, a buff to DPS mercs. I think that is good, particularly the Arsenal one I like. A little bit more damage, but nothing crazy. But they will be a little bit harder to stick to with the additional mobility they gain. And of course, Super Colto should make them even tankier than they already are. But I think a fair buff for a class that is struggling a little bit in comparison to snipers and sorcerers, for example. So overall, what did we learn? Well, the guys at Broadsword, similar to the guys at BioWare, are clearly sorcerer mains, but maybe also Arsenal enjoyers, which is fine. I would have liked to see some balance to the melee classes, where PowerTech is way better than the rest, for example. Tanks, in my opinion, are still too strong, and particularly the control of Lightning and Madness Sorcerers needs to be nerfed to make PvP overall more enjoyable. But then again, at least we're getting some balance changes. That means the developers are still working on the game. And actually, the rewards for the Galactic season are looking quite nice. So we will test it out and update the tier list and the guides if necessary. If you want to see me play the patch, then just check on my YouTube, where I'll try to upload a new video every day, or catch me when I'm streaming on Twitch. And as always, guys, if you enjoyed this video, please remember to leave it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel. I'll see you guys tomorrow.